In this lesson, we will learn how to create form fields which let users choose between a set of options. There are three different form field types that we will learn about in this lesson. Number one, the select or the drop-down box. So here we can see that in action. What is your favorite color? And if I click on this, it's a drop-down menu and I can choose between any of these options. Number two, radio inputs. So we can see an example here, favorite meal, and then you can choose between only these three options. Number three, checkboxes. We can see an example here, your pets, check all that apply. So here you're allowed to choose more than one. If you have a cat, a dog, a bird, and a fish, you can select all four. So these are our three primary tools in our toolbox for letting users choose between a predetermined set of options. Now it's important that we choose the right tool for the job. So right away we know that if we need a field where users can select more than one option, we will use the checkboxes. However, if we have a situation where we only want the user to be able to select one option, how do we know whether we should use the select or radio inputs? I recommend using the select field when users already know what they're looking for and they're really just wading through a large list of options. A common example that you're probably familiar with is seeing the select field used to ask you what state or country you live in. The select field is the perfect tool for this job because it's usually a long list of states or countries that would fill up a lot of screen space. So if we can hide those options away in a form field that only displays once you tap or click on it, that's excellent. Now, I recommend using radio inputs when there are fewer choices and you can afford the screen space to display all of them. Or if it's a more important decision, I recommend using radio inputs because it lets users be fully aware of what they're not choosing. It lets them see the options that they are excluding by choosing the option that they're choosing. Alright, so now that we've reviewed the different field types and we've explained when to use the right tool, let's get to the fun part. Let's review the code needed to create these elements. Here we are in a text editor with a blank web page. We can see the body tag is empty. And first, we'll learn how to create the select or drop-down menu. So its name is select. Obviously, the name of the element is select. Now let's try to recreate the select element that we saw earlier, which was asking users what their favorite color was. So within the select element, we can list the different options. So the first option would be red. So we'll create an element named option. And within that option field, that's where we can type red. So that's what users will see. Let's create another option named orange. And finally, we'll create a third option named yellow. Now if we save and refresh in the browser, we can see there is a select element with the different options. Now it's important to point out that this defines what users see. So these are the options that users can choose from. But you'll remember that the whole point of a form is to submit this data to a server so something actually useful can be done with the data. So we should probably add an attribute of value to each option element. And this is the data that will actually be passed along if a user chose this option. So for example, we want the user to visually see the phrase red, but maybe the data that we want to pass along to the server is color, uppercase R for red. So let's go ahead and add those values to the different options. For orange, if orange is chosen, we want to pass along a value of color orange. If they choose yellow, we want to pass along this value. Now these values are tied to the select element, so we want to add a name attribute to the select element, just like we did in previous lessons with our text inputs. So we will name this field favorite color. Now this name could have been anything. Favorite color is not a code. That's something that I just made up. So you can make up any name that you would like. Just make sure that you don't have any spaces in the name. All that remains now is a label. We need to have a label associated with this select element. So you've seen this many times before, but practice makes perfect. Label. What is your favorite color? We'll give this label an attribute of 4 with a value of favorite color. And then we'll give this select element an ID of favorite color. So if we save and refresh, now we can see that the field is labeled, and if we click on the label, it automatically highlights the field. And with that in place, our select element is now complete. Let's move on to radio inputs now. So we can delete this code for the select, and let's imagine that we want to recreate the radio inputs that ask the user what their favorite meal is. The code to create a radio input is simply input, and then we add an attribute of type with a value of radio. Now technically this will create a radio input, so if I save and refresh, we can see there is a radio input, but in its current state this is completely useless. It's not labeled and it's not associated with a question. So let's review how to associate this radio input with a value or a question or something useful. Let's begin by laying out the structure. We know that we want at least 3 options: breakfast, brunch, and lunch. So each radio input represents one of those choices. Now in order to associate these different dots or radio inputs with each other so that you can only select one at a time, we need to give them all a matching name. So we'll use the name attribute and we'll call this favorite meal. So we'll add this name to all of the different options. So you can see that now, at least in the web browser, it understands that these radio inputs are related to one another and that you should only be able to choose one at a time. Now we need to label the different options. So this first option is breakfast. The second option is brunch. And the final option is lunch. And let's not forget that we need to associate the label with the input. So on the label, we give it an attribute of for. This is for the breakfast input. So we need to add an ID on this input of breakfast. And we'll do the same for the other 2 choices. So label for brunch. Give this input an ID of brunch. Give this label for lunch, an attribute of for lunch. Give the input an ID of lunch. So now if we save and refresh, we can see at least our options are labeled, and we can click on the label itself and it selects the appropriate choice. However, even though our options are labeled, we still need to label this question. So we need text that says, what is your favorite meal? In the code, we need to wrap all of these different options in a container element named field set. So there's the start tag, here's the end tag. Let's go ahead and indent all of these options. The field set element is exactly what the name implies. It's a set of fields that are inherently related to one another. Now to label the field set as a whole, there's an element named legend. So inside the legend element is where we can label the question or the field set. So we can say, what is your favorite meal? So if we save and refresh, we can see that the field set drew a border around the associated fields, and here is our legend. Excellent. Now there's one final step before our radio inputs are complete. Just like we did with the select element, we need to add a value attribute to each choice. This is the data that gets passed along to the server once users submit the form. So for example, if a user selects breakfast as their favorite meal, we can control what data gets passed along. So we can say value equals meal 1. So if they choose breakfast, this is the data that will get passed along to the server. The value of meal 1 will be associated with the name favorite meal. Let's do the same for the other 2 inputs. Here is the second input. It will receive a value of meal 2, and the final input will receive a value of meal 3. So with that in place, our radio inputs are now complete. So we've covered select, we've covered radio inputs. That leaves checkboxes. The code to create checkboxes is essentially identical to the code that you use to create radio inputs. So let's just make a few adjustments to this radio input set to make it be a checkbox set instead. So instead of asking what is your favorite meal, Which meals do you enjoy? Check all that apply. And then for each input or each option, instead of the type attribute having a value of radio, we'll change this to checkbox. Type equals checkbox. We'll do that for all three choices. So if we save and refresh, you can see that it's the exact same functionality, only now you can choose more than one option. And that will conclude this lesson. We learned about the three primary ways to let users choose between a set of predetermined options. I'll see you in the next lesson.